Hey everyone, this is Mike from the Comic Book Trove here today with another Omnibus review, and today I'm going to take a look at the Avengers Omnibus Volume 1, taking us right back to the very beginning of the team's long history. Now this book has unfortunately been out of print for a while, so it's probably going to be pretty hard to find a copy if you were to look now, but this printing came out way back in 2011, so really it's long overdue for a reprint, I would say, and hopefully Marvel get on that and do reprint it sooner rather than later, because it'd be great for people who've come into the hobby in more recent years to get a chance to pick this up, because it is, of course, hugely significant material. I'm going to take a look in the book today, showcase it, give an idea of what this stuff is like in here, maybe just help you to decide if it's something you do want to try and hunt down now, or maybe just keep a mental note of it, put it on your radar, so to speak, so that if it does get announced for a reprint at any point, you might have an idea of whether or not it's something you want to watch out for. But we'll take a look through it anyway. So the cover, I assume if they reprinted it, they'd use the same covers again. This was a variant cover by John Romita Jr., recreating the classic Avengers issue #1 cover by Jack Kirby. The spine would surely change to small font, but otherwise would be pretty much the same. And then in the back, we've got a cover gallery here. So the first 30 issues of Avengers are what we're getting here. Straightforward. 1 to 30, no annuals or crossovers or events or team-ups or any of that stuff. Just a straight run of 30 issues, as simple as it gets, really. The book itself, here's another way of knowing that this is one of the older omnibuses. It's that kind of fake leather style that they used to use for the cover, as well as that silver omnibus logo at the top. I always kind of liked this style. It's got a nice feel to it. The faux leather does actually feel really nice. I thought it had that deluxe feeling to it. So, a bit of a shame really that they stopped doing that, but doesn't matter too much. It's not like I have an issue really with how they do it now. Yeah, so we'll take a look in here then. Obviously, really classic material in here. The first 30 issues starts off, we're talking Stan Lee, Jack Kirby as the co-creators. In here we've got the contents page, so we're seeing Avengers 1 to 30 covering September 1963 to July 66, so a near 3-year chunk of material. We get an introduction here from Stan Lee, originally written in 1988, so that in itself is quite a long time ago. And yeah, just kind of explaining the origin of the Avengers, how they came about in the context of Marvel at the time and all the other superheroes they were putting out. And the gist of it was that they just thought it would be a good idea to do a similar thing to what DC were doing with the Justice League and create a team of existing heroes who came together to take on powerful threats, really. And that's the gist of what the Avengers has always been. And it starts out here. Here's that original cover, issue #1 by Jack Kirby. Really like that. It would have been cool to get that cover on the dust jacket, but I didn't have the luxury of choice. By the time I picked this up, it was already getting very hard to find, so I was just happy to get it at all. So yeah, we start out the first issue, and I always say this to anybody who's maybe not too much of a fan of the Silver Age or just not too familiar with it, it's going to look very dated. That's probably going to be the first thing that you notice as you take a look through here. If you are obviously familiar with the Silver Age, you have a good idea of what to expect from the likes of Jack Kirby and the way that comics in general were presented at the time. It's a very dated style now, of course. The way it's written, in particular, can often read quite clunky dialogue, some dated references and language. But fundamentally, still good fun, And to me, that is in fact all part of the charm. The fact that you can read some of this stuff and have a little laugh to yourself about how, kind of cheesy sometimes it can be. But this first issue then, the team originally forms because of Loki. Loki is scheming, as he does, trying to take down Thor. In so doing, he inadvertently causes the team to unite and get together for the first time. I think he is setting up the Hulk, basically, trying to make it look like the Hulk's on a rampage, and in fact, the Hulk isn't. But everybody is easily convinced that he is because of the whole thing with the Hulk being, this kind of monster character everybody believes the worst of, certainly at this time in history. Yeah, so the team get together and join up, and it is in this final panel of the first issue where it's actually the Wasp who comes up with the name of the Avengers. There's a nice bit of trivia for you. Where did the name come from? It came from the Wasp. She suggested it, and that's what they went with. So you got the original lineup then. So it was Ant-Man, Wasp, Iron Man, Hulk, and Thor. That was your original Avengers lineup. Now the Hulk might seem like a bit of an anomaly there. It doesn't really seem like a team player. And sure enough, he does bail very quickly. Kind of just... The funny thing about the Hulk is he was written so inconsistently back in these days. You know, he couldn't quite decide what to do with the character, whether he was just a kind of brutish monster, the kind of classic Hulk smash, you know, roaring his way through destructive paths, or if he was actually intelligent and knew exactly what he was doing and could think for himself. And in here, it's like the intelligent Hulk, but he's just kind of got an attitude, you know, like a bad attitude. So yeah, he quickly leaves the team. As of this third issue, in fact, I think he's left. He's teaming up with the Submariner. Submariner has pretty much always been a anti-hero slash villain. Was often being used as a villain, really, in fact, during the Silver Age. So here we've got the Hulk and the Submariner, I think, teaming up to fight the Avengers on some island. It's been quite a long time since I read this material, to be honest, but it's always interesting stuff, you know. But undeniably, the first hugely significant issue of the series got to be this one, issue number 4. This is probably a comic that a lot of people know about, even if they haven't read it. It's the issue where Steve Rogers, Captain America, he is found in ice, having been frozen since World War II, and reawakens into what was then the modern day, but is now 60 years ago. Yeah, that man out of time element to the character was really played up right from the beginning, although it's one of those things that has now dated itself, because here he's talking about how difficult it is to struggle waking up after 20 years have passed. And now, of course, it's been 80 years since the Second World War. But one of those that's just sort of those natural things that just dates itself over time. Obviously, it's unavoidable, but it is a bit amusing to read it now. Yeah, so Cap joins the team here and becomes the mainstay, really, ever since, because what ends up happening a bit further down the line is, as of I think issue 15, the team goes through its first major shake-up in its lineup, and you get Iron Man, Thor, Wasp, and Ant-Man / Giant Man. I think he's Giant Man at this point. They all leaving just Cap to form a new team. And really one of the cool things about the Avengers, right from the very beginning, I think, is the kind of revolving door of members, really. It's a team that has, over the years, had so many different members. And it keeps things interesting as you read through it, you know, when new characters are coming and going. So, generally speaking, you don't have one specific lineup of characters for a long time. Issue 8, an issue that's probably going to become a very popular key issue, if it hasn't already. I'm not a collector of key issues or anything like that, so not necessarily in the know, but it's the first appearance of Kang the Conqueror, anyway, who we know is coming in the MCU, so I feel like this is an issue that's going to start to get a lot of attention from collectors. And Kang is he's a time-traveling kind of warlord, really. He goes through time and space, conquers different eras. Pretty interesting character. And he's been a bit of an arch-villain of the Avengers for a long time. Obviously, you know, since issue 8. Issue 9, you get the introduction of Wonder Man. Funny thing about Wonder Man, I think, if I remember rightly, from the kind of behind-the-scenes stuff, shortly after this comic was produced, there was a bit of tension, I suppose you could say, with DC getting in touch with Marvel and saying, we don't want you to use a character called Wonder Man, it's too similar to Wonder Woman. So Stan Lee made the decision that they were going to kill off this Wonder Man guy. And he does get killed off, like in an issue. Pretty early on. But then later on, if I'm not getting this mixed up, I think when Marvel had Power Man, Luke Cage, DC came out with Power Girl. So he just kind of thought, well, if you're going to do that, then whatever, we'll bring Wonder Man back. And so Wonder Man ended up coming back anyway down the line. and I think he joined the Avengers for quite a long time. Pretty cool. Here's an issue where Spider-Man appears. Spider-Man never really an issue with a member of the Avengers, but now and again they'd cross paths. So what we're seeing, by the way, in here then, so only the first 8 issues been drawn by Jack Kirby. You know, the Avengers are, you know, obviously a Jack Kirby, Stan Lee co-creation. But Kirby really didn't stay on this title for long, completely unlike things like Fantastic Four or Thor. You know, the ones that he illustrated for a long time. He was really off this book very quickly. After 8 issues, he was gone, except for a couple of issues where he did some pencil layouts for other artists. But the main artist through here really is Don Heck, who does an okay job. But to be totally honest, Don Heck is not an artist whose work really stands out to me as having a particularly high quality to it. Don't get me wrong, he was a very capable artist who does a perfectly fine job in here and in the other books that he did. But it just doesn't stand out to me. It's not one of the great kind of runs of art. If I was going to list my favourite artists, for example, you know, Don Heck wouldn't make it, I'm sorry to say. Which, again, I don't mean to sound overly harsh, it's just that it just doesn't stand out. It's just kind of, it is what it is. But, yeah, there's obviously nothing wrong with it. So, what we're seeing here then, if we just backtrack a little bit here, where we are at the point, where's the issue number? Issue 16. Yeah, here we go. So this is where the new team comes about. Now, this is really very interesting for the time. Pretty risky, actually, because what we'd seen up to this point, the first 15 issues, we had a team of kind of already well-established heroes, you know, Iron Man, Thor, Captain America. All had quickly made names for themselves as popular superheroes, but what we see here is, as I mentioned already, Thor, Iron Man, Giant Man, Wasp, they all leave. And they're replaced by characters who, whilst they're all best known as heroes now, up until this point, had been villains. So we get Hawkeye comes in, and Scarlet Witch, and Quicksilver. And this is an era that is generally referred to as Cap's Quirky Quartet, I think, or Kooky Quartet. Cap's, I can't speak. Cap's Kooky Quartet, I think, is the one. Yeah, just a nice little tongue twister challenge for myself to barely pass. Yeah, so it was a really, really interesting thing to do because, as I say, these characters had been villains up until this point. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver had been in Magneto's Brotherhood of Evil Mutants over in X-Men. I think Hawkeye had been an Iron Man villain to start with. So it was a fairly bold move at the time for Stan Lee to decide to do that. But I think it really works because it makes the book become more experimental. They can do more stuff because I think what was tying the book down originally was the fact that Iron Man, Thor, these characters were starring in their own solo adventures, and I think it was just getting a bit tricky to manage what they were doing in those books and also in this book so that it didn't create weird continuity problems. Here you had characters who weren't featuring in their own stories, although Cap soon was, but for the most part the rest of the team, they weren't. So it just opened the door, I think, creatively for them to do more stuff without having to worry about creating any continuity problems as the Marvel Universe expanded. Nowadays, that's not much of a concern. I think they've got it all pretty well managed, but that's what was going on back in the day at this point, I think. Anyway, it's an interesting lineup, and it's nice to see different characters being introduced to the team as you follow it through. The Swordsman comes in here. Interesting guy. I think he comes in initially. He is trying to join the team, but then it's revealed that he is actually a villain. But then later on, I think he actually does become a good guy. There's a lot of twists and turns in this series, both in this book specifically, and then in the content that we see in future volumes. And I will say that if you're interested in the Avengers, and if you don't mind reading Silver Age books, I always say I understand that they're not for everybody. They are a very different style of comic to what we're more used to seeing these days. But we've got another Stan Lee issue. But yeah, I think it's really fun, worth checking out. It's not as good as Silver Age things like Amazing Spider-Man or Fantastic Four, but it's certainly good. You know, there are worse things to read from that era, no doubt. But there's also some frustrating things, you know. To say that it's interesting and worth reading is one thing, but I have to also point out some of the negatives. And for example, Scarlet Witch, I think, is very weak as a character. I mean, literally, like physically, her power is just not very strong. Certainly, she wasn't anywhere near the power levels that have been established for her in more modern times. Back at this point, these early days, I think her powers really just amount to just creating acts of chance. I think that's what it is. Like, she can make she just sort of helps the chance along with things. Like, she can make a scaffolding fall down, or she can make somebody trip up, you know, stuff like that. Really not particularly powerful. Slightly ironic, given that she ended up becoming super powerful. Quicksilver, you know, he's all right. He's you know, he runs fast. It's simple as that, really. And Hawkeye is really the main kind of where the tension in the team comes from. He's the one who's the most confrontational with Cap. You know, he's got an arrogance to him. He thinks he should be leading the team. So the dynamic between those two is often fairly competitive, I'd say. That's where you get a lot of that kind of character conflict comes from. The interactions between those two. And yeah, so seeing, you know, a lot of different villains being utilised. We've got Kang coming back here. We've seen the Enchantress and the Executioner coming over from Thor. Here we've got, I think, Ravonna, the kind of reluctant consort, I suppose you could say, kind of character to Kang. He's constantly trying to win her love. She's sort of not really interested, but has to stay by his side anyway. Yeah, as I say, Kang, pretty recurring villain throughout Avengers history. Pretty interesting guy. I'm looking forward to seeing what they do in the MCU when he starts to get properly introduced. We shall see. Doctor Doom. Now, whenever Doom's involved, generally speaking, you're always going to have an interesting story. He's pretty much the absolute best Marvel villain, in my opinion. Who's this guy? Cannot remember that villain for the life of me. This is the issue, though. That's the only thing. When you haven't read the stuff for a long time, easy to forget some of the specific issues. A tumor. Okay, yeah, a tumor. Pretty standard kind of warlord villain. Great to see as well. I haven't really touched on it so far, but all the letters pages, you know, in here as well. Always good for giving that insight to readers' thoughts from the time. Always a cool inclusion. I think the thing is with the Avengers, though, similar to a lot of Marvel's Silver Age output, to be honest, is that it really got going, you know, a little bit down the line. It didn't start out really strong from the beginning. Now, I think in the case of the Avengers, the stuff that's written by Stan Lee, which is the first 35 issues, so that's everything in this omnibus, and then the first bit of volume 2, is all fine. You know, there's definitely some good bits. But I think the Avengers really moved up a gear to another level of quality completely when Roy Thomas took over as a writer, and then he was working with primarily John and Sal Buscema as the artists, the regular artists on the series. So really, between Thomas's writing and the Buscema's artwork, I think, yeah, the series was just massively helped by that. And, you know, I will get on to volume 2 and 3 and 4 at some point in the future on the channel as well, and review those. Because those are honestly more enjoyable for me overall, I've got to say. But like I say, you know, you start to see the lineup changing again. So even here we've got Giant Man's coming back into it, the Wasp has come back. You know, characters are always coming and going. Black Widow here in her original style of costume before she got the kind of black leather kind of catsuit thing. So yeah, then we move on to extras in the back with some original cover sketches, artwork. Always good inclusions. Interesting to flick through. What else we got? Some reprint covers. You know, the pages were thicker on these old omnibuses as well. Like, they stick together quite a bit, I find. These are cool, like some, what are these, Marvel Masterworks covers? Yeah, then an Alex Ross reinterpretation of Avengers issue 4, classic Cap coming back cover. Yeah, so you know, classic Avengers material. You know, literally the beginning of the team, and a cool book to have. A cool book that I think is well worth checking out for Avengers fans, certainly, and a good bit of Silver Age reading for people who enjoy the era. Now, just hope, really, like I said back at the beginning, that this book does get a reprint, because it's just, yeah, it's just frustrating, really, when these books go out of print for many years. But I'm hopeful, because recently we've had the reprints of Mighty Thor Omnibus Volume 1, the X-Men Volumes 1 and 2, and they had been long out of print for many years as well. So hopefully this will follow suit, and we'll see it come back into print before too long. But anyway, guys, let me know your thoughts on this series and the classic Avengers stuff on this omnibus, if you've got it, or just let me know whether or not you're interested in it. Always be happy to hear what people have to say on this stuff. But thank you very much for watching. I always appreciate that, and I'll be back again soon and discuss something else.